the Zoom link in the description. Before we get started with the proper meeting, though, I'll be playing some clips of Black Lives Matter events around the world. Starting us off is Comrade Eugene Puryear from the Party for Socialism and Liberation in the USA, addressing a crowd in Philadelphia.
Because they are the ones who are causing the violence. The real outside agitators are the cops that come from the suburbs, that shoot down our brothers and sisters, that harass us and stop and frisk, that treat every young black person like a criminal. Come on. They don't care about peace. They don't care about justice. I don't care if they kneel. I don't care if they hold a sign. I don't care if they put out a press release. I don't even care if they hand out water here today. It's all an attempt to take you away from the reality that it's not this movement that has caused chaos. It's the 400 years of racist oppression that black people aren't going to take anymore. You know, they always say, well, it's just a few bad apples. And I always wondered, when people say that, if they just have never heard the whole thing. Because, well, I'm originally a country boy, and I know the quote, it's one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. It's not just one. Every single one of them is rotten, and rotten to the core. If you would stand alongside someone who would murder someone in the street for no reason, you are just as rotten. You are just as complicit. You are just as responsible. And if you're one of these black cops that says, well, I know what it is, well, then why are you doing what you're doing?
Period.
You're doubly complicit because you know it's wrong. So we aren't going to allow any of these fake side issues to stop us from what we need. Justice for George Floyd. Justice for Breonna Taylor. Justice for all victims of police murder. But we also know it goes deeper than that. That this is systemic. And when we say systemic, people say, well, what does that mean? Well, just think about it like this. The police allegedly are supposed to make sure that people follow the law. But what is the law? Who makes the law? Are the laws just? Are the laws just?
No!
Are the laws just? So just right there, you know, if they're designed to enforce the law, they are designed to enforce injustice. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It's not a problem, it's working the way it's supposed to. The cops draw their lineage from the slave patrols. The slave patrols say if you're black, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't go here, all you can do is work. Well, we're talking about curfews now. What are the curfews they put on young black people in the summer if not a slave patrol? You can't go here, you can't go there. It's the same struggle, it's the same system. Capitalism and imperialism was built on the backs of the genocide of Native Americans, the enslavement of African Americans, the exploitation of working class people. It can't operate without it. They said we'll give you a black president, and Ferguson had to erupt under a black president because it doesn't matter what color the face in the high place. If the system remains the same, the system remains unjust. Something beautiful is happening right now in the U.S. Look to your left, look to your right, look behind you where, by the way, hundreds of people are still coming to join this demonstration. People came out on the streets and said they wouldn't take it anymore, so they charged the cop. People came out in the streets, and every brand is cynical. We know they don't want to lose customers, but every brand in the country is scrambling to act like they are with us. It wasn't voting, no disrespect, but it was the power of the people that made every single elite institution in this country acknowledge the justice of what we are doing. Everybody loves to look back, and they love to talk about things that happened in the past and how we have to be like them. People will say, well, we had the civil rights movement in this country. Well, I don't know if people forgot, but the civil rights movement meant people got into the street and broke the law. They went to jail. No politicians cared about civil rights until black people started to shut this country down. People will say, they'll tell you in school, well, you know, in the 1930s, Roosevelt was the president and he helped unions grow. That's a lie. Do you know what really happens? People sat down in their factories. They took over the plants. They shut down production. And they said, ain't nobody gonna make $1 until we get justice. So there's two things that we can do. Now we can listen to all the people who didn't do anything for years, you know, like Joe Biden, who created mass incarceration and now wants to take a knee. We can do what they want us to do. And we've heard it before. Trust us. Just go to the polls, cast a ballot. Trust us. Trust us. Sometimes I wonder, what was George Floyd thinking during those 9 minutes? Because I know watching the video, I just kept thinking of all these people who said, trust us, we'll do something about it. So we could go that route. But from my point of view, we could go another route. And that's to stay in the streets and make this country ungovernable. If workers don't work, they can't make money. If protests paralyze the streets, they can't make money. This is the United States, the almighty dollar controls everything. So if you want to put it all behind money, we're going to stop your money until Black life matters in this country. This is not a riot, this is an uprising. This is not a riot, this is a rebellion. And successful uprisings and rebellions become revolutions. I believe and I remember the comrades in Haiti in 1791 who rose up against the slave owner. And yeah, they burned everything to the ground, but they ended up free. So we have to ask ourselves, will we stay passive or will we fight for our freedom? Will we fight? Will we fight? Will we fight? Will we fight? Turn to your neighbor and say, I'll fight with you. Turn to your other neighbor and say, I'll fight with you. And now say all together that we're going to stay together and we're going to fight until everybody is free. They never think it can happen until it does. Let them laugh at us. Let them ridicule us. Let them get a job. Let them say whatever they want to say. We are an unstoppable force that will bring this capitalist system to its knees. That will get people over profit. That will fight for socialism in this country. So I thank all of you who are here today. I think the hundreds still trying to join this demonstration. I'll fight with you. We'll fight together until we're all free. Power to the people.
The funeral industry.
So that was Comrade Eugene Puryear in Philadelphia We're shortly going to be hearing from a comrade from Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, Newcastle.
This is amazing. What? 2,000, 3,000 people out on the streets today. Amazing. I'm from a group called Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism. My first question is, what the hell are all these police doing out on the streets here today? I can see you hiding around the corner. I can see you following us about when we're marching. This is our democratic right. We don't need you to facilitate our protests. We can do that all on our own. You think that Newcastle police are somehow different to police in Minneapolis? Newcastle police equal racist police. We see you stopping and searching young black people. We see the police raiding black and Asian businesses. We see immigration police kicking down the doors of asylum seekers at 6 in the morning. And the police, they're terrified at the power that we hold here. Because together we are stronger. Together we can win. And did you know that the British government is supplying the US with riot shields, with gas, with so-called rubber bullets? The US, Britain, is supplying the police with those kinds of things, right? We have to ask, why are police in the US and Britain murdering black people? We have to get under the surface. We need to understand why it's happening. What is the root cause? If we're going to pull those roots out and stop this problem once and for all. You look at the nature of Britain. Britain is an imperialist power. One of the most powerful countries on the planet. The US is the most powerful country on the planet. Yeah, how come with all of their wealth and resources, how come, number one, the US has the biggest COVID deaths on the planet? Britain has the second largest amount of COVID deaths on the planet. It's because they've been too focused on oppressing, on occupying, on bombing every corner of this planet. They try and tell us that migrants are a threat to the economy. They try and tell us that asylum seekers are a threat to the economy. They try and tell us that the unemployed, the sick and the disabled are a threat to the economy. They try and sow racism in our communities so that we're fighting each other. Well, the NHS is in the state it's in because the government is a capitalist government and it has been cutting funding. And they try and deny access to healthcare and housing to migrants and black people. And we're here today to say that we will not fight another member of the working class over the council house. We will not fight another member of the working council on the job. Instead, we will stand shoulder to shoulder until we win decent housing, healthcare, jobs and services for all. I'll say one more thing, then I'll pass this on. Unfortunately, and I might not get many cheers for this, unfortunately, it's not as easy as fuck Boris. Racism has existed in Britain for decades and decades, yeah? Boris, the Tories, Theresa May, as reactionary and as anti-working class as they are, they didn't create racism in Britain. Margaret Thatcher died a long time ago. Yeah? If Boris Johnson goes tomorrow, racism will still be here. Yeah? We need to remember that the last Labour... One more minute, please. We need to remember that the last Labour government introduced 5 unprecedented immigration acts in 10 years. No other government has introduced as many racist immigration laws than the Labour Party. The last Labour government, when they came to power, there was 1 immigration prison. When they left, there were 12. They introduced 4,200 new criminal offences. Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the Labour Party, he promised that if Labour got elected, they would hire 1,000 new border guards, 3,000 new prison officers, 10,000 new police. That's 14,000 more hired hitmen to murder black people and migrants. Change will not come about from the ballot box. Change will come from the streets. These politicians that come out now telling us to stay at home, they tell us to get on our doorstep, check our name on the doorstep when no one can see it. They say don't protest. They say stay at home, clap for the NHS, don't protest. They say write a letter to your MP, don't protest. They say vote Labour, don't protest. But we're not having that. We're going to stand here until real change comes about. Pandemic, we've never seen anything like it before. People are worried. People want life to get back to normal. But what is getting back to normal? Police killing black people. You want to go back to normal? No. Councils cutting our services. You want to go back to normal? No. Migrants being locked up in immigration prisons. You want to go back to normal? No. There is no going back to normal. Yeah. Will never be the same again. There's no going back. 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 Meeting on Tuesday, 7:30, online, on Zoom. Please join in. We can discuss together what action we take next.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to our today. Don't forget to join us on Zoom, as we're nearly ready to start over there on Zoom, and just see yourself on the Black Lives Matter protest in.
Like this shit's just happening now.
People here today to protest about police brutality against systemic racism all across the imperialist world. The British capitalist class and their sycophants have been quick to condemn the so-called violence and looting occurring in protests across the world. But was not Britain's wealth built off looting the resources of colonized people? When Britain kidnapped untold millions of Africans and used those profits to fund their industrial revolution. subtle. It's subtle, so today we cannot be subtle. Today we must tell them that this is not right. You understand? Does everybody understand? So can you say it with me? Let's get marching! 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 Let's get marching!
Modern Babylon, top 1% oblivious, the backs standing on attack all class, terrorizing these fantasy niggas with their numbers, shaking at the surface, to the tooth in the rack war surplus, with the bottom move then the top get nervous, hands up, don't shoot motherfuckers. Now that's a death sentence. 41 shots was bled of souls hesses. 2014, 6 shots, same message. Wanna be cops, kill the kids for how they dress it. Courts let them work, so we react with aggression. What the fuck was you expecting?
So there was some footage of recent Black Lives Matter events in Nottingham and around the world. Don't forget to join our Zoom call, which is now underway. And when the introductions start, you will see them on this channel. So stay tuned. This is just a reminder that our meeting is now underway. People are having a chat in a Zoom call, so feel free to join us if you want to get involved. And when the introductions start, you will see them here.
Everybody, thank you very much for coming to tonight's meeting. Welcome. Tonight's meeting's been organised, as I'm sure you've seen, by the Revolutionary Communist Group. I'm sure some of you at least will have come across us at the march on Sunday in Nottingham, hopefully. So a little bit of kind of about who we are. Since 1979, we've been publishing a newspaper called Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, which I'm sure somebody's going to post a link to in the chat. Because we hold that the fight against racism is central to the interests of the whole.
Has anyone else just lost James?
I lost James, yeah. Yeah, screen's gone black for me.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
I
you've
can
gone
hear you
back to
now.
normal.
Oh, right. Okay, that's strange. Where did I get to?
Fight against racism, and then you stopped.
Okay, so I was saying that we in the RSG have been publishing Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism since 1979 because we view the fight against racism as central to the interests of the whole working class. Then I was saying, hello, I'm James. I'll be chairing tonight. And I'm a regular contributor to Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism. I've written on a number of issues, including the racist treatment of migrants in Calais and the Windrush scandal. Clearly, I obviously don't have any personal experience of being treated in a racist way. So I don't personally have that experience, and it's worth saying that, we aren't here to kind of lecture anybody about what it's like to be on the receiving end of racism in any form. But what we're hoping is that this meeting can provide a space for a serious political discussion about the way forward for an anti-racist movement, taking in a range of people's views and experiences. So to sort of set up the meeting, if you just kind of think about the tumultuous kind of period that we're in the middle of a global pandemic, which is undeniably hitting Black and minority ethnic and oppressed people the hardest. In the middle of that, we have this movement, this global, developing global anti-racist movement. And in just a few short weeks in the United States, the murderers of George Floyd have been charged. Police precincts have been set on fire. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets to demand the defunding or the abolition of police departments, with at least one city council saying that they will acquiesce. And President Trump, on one occasion, has had to hide in a bunker. And then if you look in Britain, in the last week, the statue of the celebrated slave dealer Edward Colston has been torn down, and an anti-racist movement has begun with huge demonstrations in dozens of towns and cities. Fearing the power of the multi-ethnic anti-racist street movement, local governments and other institutions have started announcing that they're going to remove the statues themselves through legitimate means, basically in order to prevent the power of the street movement taking them down, using our own collective power. So this moment poses quite serious questions for those of us who want to see a better world. Where now for the fight against racism, and in a lot of ways, more importantly, what will it take for us to win? And that's what we'll be discussing this evening. So how this is going to work, the kind of layout of the meeting. We're going to hear two introductions first. Those introductions are being streamed live to Facebook Live and YouTube. If you are watching on Facebook Live or YouTube, we're going to be having discussion afterwards, but you'll have to move across to the Zoom meeting, which the link will be available to you. You should be able to easily find it. And then we're gonna have discussion, which will start by going into sort of smaller breakout rooms in order to kind of facilitate easier discussion, and then we'll come back together. So first of all, we're going to hear from Lee, who is an anti-racist activist with the Revolutionary Communist Group and a regular contributor to Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism. Lee's going to lay out the development and the importance of the political movement in the US against state racism. And following Lee, we'll hear from Tom on the roots of racism in Britain. So Tom is an experienced anti-racist activist and was a founding member of Tyneside Community Action for Refugees in 2006 and the Migration and Asylum Justice Forum in 2015. He's written 2 books and numerous articles about British state racism and imperialism, informed by extensive research that has included contributions from hundreds of refugees and migrants. He's a regular contributor to our newspaper, FRFI, and along with several other people in this meeting, he was in attendance with the RCG at Sunday's Black Lives Matter demonstration. So that's it. If people could turn their cameras on when we get to discussion, but I'll remind people let's just pass over to Lee.
Yeah, cool. Cheers. So, I'm just going to get on with it. In the past couple of weeks, as everyone here knows, there have been protests across the US with a size and militancy that hasn't been seen in the country for well over half a century now. There have been hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets across every single state, which has inspired movements across the entire world. And it all seemingly began with the murder of George Floyd, an African-American man who was suffocated to death on camera by white police officer Derek Chauvin for allegedly using a forged $20 bill. This outpouring of anger that we've seen has been a result of decades of racist violence at the hands of police in the United States and centuries more of colonialism, segregation, and slavery. The protests following Floyd's death are, in one sense, a resurgence of anger that was demonstrated on the streets with the Black Lives Matter movement in 2012, but in another sense, they address a far deeper and more long-standing legacy of systemic racism in the United States. On the Tuesday after George Floyd's murder was filmed and shared around social media, people began to gather for a protest at the site of Floyd's death, and there were already calls for arrest of the officers. 2 hours after people started gathering, the responding officers to Floyd's death had been fired, and 2 hours after that, protesters had already begun to block traffic at the site of the upcoming protest. The crowd marched to a Minneapolis police precinct, and when they got there, they faced off against the Minneapolis police, who were liberal with their use of pepper spray as protesters chanted, and in some cases threw water bottles. Police ultimately failed to disband the crowd. Protests continued throughout these first days and nights in Minneapolis, and they very quickly began to gain momentum. The police had resorted to their usual crowd control tactics, which are, tear gas, flashbang grenades, and rubber bullets that were shot at protesters. The police brought in chemical weapons and full riot gear, and the people responded. Police cars were burnt, a Target was looted, and shop windows were smashed, along with various small fires being started around the city. George Floyd was killed on Monday, and by 9 p.m. on Thursday, protesters in Minneapolis had been out on the streets for 4 days and nights. The Minneapolis police precinct was evacuated, and then it was set ablaze as thousands of people looked on and cheered, setting off fireworks and chanting anti-racist slogans. This was probably the point that the mainstream media really knuckled down on what became their chosen narrative. They divided up the protesters into two camps: the peaceful locals who were trying to get justice and fix the situation the nice, non-violent way on one side, and on the other side, violent looters and rioters who had come in from outside the city with the intention of smashing up stores and causing what Minneapolis Governor Tim Walz has called absolute chaos. In this version of events, those who set fire to the precinct and those who peacefully marched and chanted against police brutality could not be the same people and were not on the same side. Not only this, but as it was told, they were opposing forces, with the violent protesters being an active threat to the non-violent ones. The police chief of Minneapolis PD told the Minneapolis media at the time that the display had been hijacked by some protesters, those looting and vandalizing businesses. As the days went on, this narrative became more and more entrenched in mainstream media of outside forces, professionally organized agitators, or even foreign-backed groups with a thirst for destruction being the culprit of property damage, even as protests sprung up across every single state in the US, moving into rural towns and suburban neighborhoods as well as the bigger cities, even including predominantly white areas that had limited or no involvement in anti-racist movements in past years. The police, unlike the mainstream media, did not distinguish between violent and non-violent protesters. The attacks from the cops were totally indiscriminate. Many officers were recorded covering up their badge names and numbers as they pepper sprayed, tear gassed, flash bombed, and shot at everyone in their vicinity, whether they were throwing objects at police cars, marching through the streets with anti-racist placards, or recording events on their phones. Cities like San Jose, Atlanta, Chicago, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. saw intense nights of protest inspired by what was happening in Minneapolis. And they too faced the same violence from police. Footage of police brutality against civilians, journalists, and medics began coming out with increasing regularity, both on social media and across national and international news networks. Particularly high-profile incidents were a black CNN journalist and his team getting arrested live on air while reporting on the protests, and a freelance photojournalist being left half blind after a rubber bullet was shot into her eye, also live on air. And on Friday of the first week, which was May 29th, 4 days after the protests had begun, Donald Trump tweeted, "These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty, and we will assume control. But when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you." For those not aware, that last bit about looting and shooting is a direct reference from white Miami Police Chief Walter Headley, who was chief in the 1960s and declared war on criminals in Miami, telling his officers that any force up to and including death is proper when apprehending a felon. Walter Headley was speaking in response to civil rights movements in Miami in the 60s. He stated that law enforcement was going after young hoodlums from 15 to 21 who have taken advantage of the civil rights campaign. We don't mind being accused of police brutality. They haven't seen anything yet. Trump also threatened on Friday to send in the National Guard, who are state-based, not technically military forces that can be called upon by the respective states to deal with any range of situations from, and quoting the US Constitution, although it technically talks about the militia instead of the National Guard, including repelling invasions, executing the laws, and suppressing revolutions. The National Guard were deployed in the eventuality with 62,000 guardsmen over the US, fully geared up to beat down the uprisings, equipped with body armor, shields, and an armory of weapons to be used against protesters. On Friday afternoon, Derek Chauvin, the officer who killed George Floyd, was charged with murder of the third degree. But by this point, the protests were very clearly not about justice for only one man. A large number of protesters across the country were condemning systemic racism in the US, as well as openly demanding the abolition of the police, to the extent that news companies ranging from The Independent, the BBC, Fox News, The Guardian, the NYT, and the Washington Post were all scrambling to address the abolition or defunding of the police. And across the country, the protests continued to gain momentum, and the local states cracked down with ever-increasing ferocity. In Chicago, meal handouts for schools were suspended for a day, prompted by unrest, as the Chicago Tribune put it. Food, water, and milk that was being handed out to protesters by members of the community was caught on film being destroyed by police officers in numerous areas, and curfews were set up in over 50 different cities, after which point being outside was a criminal action, and police were patrolling suburban areas and in one instance shot paint rounds at people who were filming the patrols from the porches of their own homes. Police utilized the curfews to trap protesters until curfew began, at which point they would descend upon them for breaking curfew and make massive arrests. Not more than a week into the national uprising, the NYPD were filmed driving an SUV into crowds of protesters. After days of cowering in a bunker in the White House as people demonstrated peacefully on the White House lawn, Donald Trump's team decided on Monday, June the 1st, that he needed to counteract the unflattering image that his inaction made. And the team ordered the peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square to be dispersed so that Trump could take a nice stroll to a nearby church, hold up a Bible, and make a speech declaring himself the president of law and order. He then said that the nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others, and blamed state and local government for not taking necessary action. The dispersal of the crowd for his photo op involved shooting smoke canisters and pellets at the crowd, and low-flying military helicopters hovered over the area, close enough to the ground to kick up debris and toppling a tree onto the protesters. Now, we don't have time to go through every instance of recorded police brutality that we've seen since the beginning of the uprising. What is clear is this, that the police, backed up by the National Guard, are fighting a war against the people across the United States. They have kettled, beaten, hosed down, driven into, shot at, gassed, goaded, framed, and otherwise terrorized whoever they find on the streets. A governor called for no quarter against the people, and the president threatened to deploy the army. The National Guard have joined the police as an occupying force in countless cities. Now, it's been noted that the US hasn't seen this level of rage on the streets since the riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King. The police's use of violence against protesters has done nothing but made it crystal clear to the American people that the police are their enemy. So, The police and the news have been trying out all sorts of propaganda tactics. Stories about officers kneeling with protesters, speaking with the crowds, and gravely shaking people's hands have emerged on all kinds of forums. But so far, this propaganda has not at all defanged the fight back. Videos of police shaking hands with protesters is pretty easily counteracted with evidence that only hours later, the same police were beating the same protesters with batons and firing tear gas at them. The usual routes that are used to shut down people's anger and divert the movement have proved ineffective. And in that anger, people are looking for places to turn and finding that the institutions of power in the US are unwilling to provide fundamental change. Now, in Austin, Texas, the council, which is entirely made up of Democrats, heard several hours of impassioned pleading by members of their community, describing in tearful detail the racism of the local police force and the violence they and their families had faced at the hands of the Austin PD during the protests, asking them not to grant funding to the department. David Johnson of Grassroots Leadership told the council that he would rather you throw the money in a dumpster than give it to the APD, because at least I'm not worried about a dumpster killing my son. A few days later, it was revealed that Austin officials, after hearing the people, had taken a vote to approve a grant of almost $431,000 to be given to the Austin Police Department. Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate for presidency, failed abysmally at responding to the situation, unsurprisingly, when he said that instead of shooting people in the heart, perhaps officers should instead shoot at the legs. Biden is one of the authors of the infamous 1994 Tough on Crime law that saw a massive expansion in incarceration, mostly of black and brown citizens, as well as more aggressive policing, saying at the time to lock the SOBs up. And Bernie Sanders, former Democratic nominee, seen at the time by many as the more progressive option for president, has made it clear that he isn't on side either, saying that he's instead calling for well-educated, well-trained, well-paid professionals in police departments, and that anyone who thinks we should abolish police departments in America, I don't agree. The promises that politicians and police officers understand the frustration of the people ring totally hollow when their actions contradict what they're saying. There is nowhere, it seems, for the mass movement to turn to but to each other. And overwhelmingly, that is what's happened. The looting of stores and businesses is only one side of the story. Food, water, and supplies from many of the looted businesses have been used in community efforts to feed and provide water to protesters. And in Seattle, people have set up a barricaded 6-block autonomous zone in Capitol Hill around the East Police Precinct. And this was after thousands of people marched a line of riot police back while chanting, "Whose streets? Our streets." Minneapolis officials recently promised to defund the police, and Chauvin's charge was bumped up to second degree. But the people have still not gone home and abandoned the protests. The uprising in the US is not just about George Floyd and Derek Chauvin, although Floyd's brutal murder was a catalyst. It's risen out of decades, centuries of racist violence, and the anger of the people has come to a boiling point. And that's where I'm going to finish.
Thank you very much, Lee. Very, very thorough explanation of events so far in the United States. So what we'll do now is we'll hear from Tom, who's going to put things into a British context. So take it away, Tom.
Thank you. Yes, so we've heard about recent events, and I'm sure we all know a fair bit about the racism facing Black people and other racialized minorities in the United States. Britain is different, but also deeply racist. I'm sure there's a huge amount of knowledge within this meeting, and I hope we can share that in the discussion. For now, I'm just going to briefly go over some of the main aspects of racism in Britain and put forward our understanding, the RCG's developed, of that racism, the roots of that racism in imperialist capitalism, and the implications of that for the fight against racism. So if we look at a few statistics, in England and Wales since 1990, there have been 1,741 deaths in custody or otherwise as a result of contact with the police. Black people in England and Wales make up around 3% of the population, but they make up 8% of those deaths from contact with the police. And those deaths don't include the deaths in prisons and immigration detention centres, which nearly up to 3,000 people who've died in prisons and immigration camps in the last 10 years. Black people and many other racialized minorities also have much greater likelihood of being stopped by the police, of being arrested, remanded in custody while they're on trial, being given longer sentences on average, and are also more frequently detained under the Mental Health Act. And in many respects, this is actually getting worse. So if we look sort of how the direction things are heading over the last 5 years, 5 years ago, the year 2014 to 2015, 13% of stop and searches were carried out on Black people and 8% were carried out on Asian people. So bear in mind, that's already massively disproportionate compared to these groups, sections of society within the population. But by last year, by 2018 to 19, this had shot up to 22% of police stops were carried out on Black people and 13% were carried out on Asian people. Overall, ethnic minorities account for 14% of the population, but 27% of its prison population. Black people specifically represent 3% of the population, as said, but 12% of the prison population. And for young people and children, it's actually even worse. 40% of prisoners in England and Wales who are under the age of 18 were from a racialized minority, and 29% of young offenders, people detained under the age of 18, were Black, 29%. And this is also getting worse over recent years. All minority ethnic groups also have longer sentences on average than white people when they are sent to prison. And there are some other figures there on the slide. What this means is that the increased likelihood of ending up in prison if you're a Black person in Britain is actually worse than if you're a Black person in the United States, although it's more widely talked about the situation in the US. And that doesn't even include the thousands of Black people locked up indefinitely and without charge in Britain's immigration prisons, where abuse from guards has been widely documented. The treatment that Black people receive within police custody in prisons also shows the racism of the system. And this is even if you go on the government's own inspections, this is what the government's own agencies admit. So their statistics show that African Caribbean people are more likely than any other ethnic group to be strip searched by British police. And again, it's particularly extreme for children and young people. So in recent years, 48% of the children and young people who were subjected to strip searches inside youth offending institutions were Black or Asian. Surveys of prisoners show that racialized minority prisoners are less likely to feel safe in prison, less likely to report being treated with respect by guards, more likely to report outright abuse from guards, and less likely to feel that they can make a complaint or that they'll have complaints handled fairly if they make a complaint. The racism of British society is also reflected in racialised minorities having lower average wages, in working disproportionately in jobs and sectors that are typically low paid and insecure, being less likely to receive state support, having higher rates of homelessness and overcrowded housing, and higher rates of long-term limiting illness and disability. So what this means overall in class terms is that racialised minorities in Britain are disproportionately concentrated among poorer sections of the working class and face more extreme conditions of exploitation because of the racism that they face. This toxic mix has contributed to Black people being 4 times more likely than white people to die from COVID-19 in the current pandemic. Go on to the next slide. Thank you. Of course, racism is not a new issue, and for centuries people have rebelled, they have protested, lobbied, stood candidates for election, they've educated, prayed, and organised. The most significant victories against racism have been won through mass direct action by people themselves and led by people directly facing racism. Some cases, this has been when the people have seized power. Just some examples from the Haitian slave revolt to the Cuban Revolution. Or in other cases, there have been concessions made because there has been such a threat of revolution by the people that the ruling class have felt that they have no choice but to make concessions in order to try and hang on to a power. Examples of that include end to racial segregation in the United States, in a legal sense at least, and the end of apartheid in South Africa. As Frederick Douglass famously said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Yet despite these centuries of struggle, racism persists. And so if we're serious about ending racism, we have to ask where it comes from and what sustains it. We have to dig deeper. Go off the slide. Racism has a long history, but its modern form emerged with capitalism. Capitalism was built on the back of the wealth, the land, and the labour that was stolen from other countries by European colonialism and by the enslavement and forced transportation of millions of Africans, estimated at least 2 million of whom died in the process. And from the billions of pounds in compensation that was paid to the former owners of freed slaves. That paid for the factories and the infrastructure that were built in Britain in the so-called Industrial Revolution. And how could they justify this barbaric robbery and murder in a country that prided itself and continues to pride itself on liberal values and democracy? How could they avoid the risk that British workers, themselves oppressed and exploited, might unite with those who had been enslaved and colonized? Only through racism, by portraying those oppressed by Britain as less than human. Today, as in the past, racism reflects and sustains the capitalist ordering of the world. British capitalism depends on the exploitation of workers and resources in many other countries, whose populations are put into one or other category of a racial other. This is imperialism. Britain's imperialist plunder involves a complex web of international investments, financial transfers, and debt. Go on to the next slide. In 2004, Britain's external assets, so its foreign investments, totaled nearly £10,172 billion. That's how much British capitalists own in other countries. And that is more than 5.5 times the size of Britain's domestic economy. And that is out of relative proportion, out of all proportion compared to other countries. through history. In recent years, the rates of return from capital that British capitalists have invested elsewhere, so that has been 9% on average from direct investments in Africa and 13% from direct investments in Asia. And that compares with the much lower rate of return of 5% from investments within Britain. And given the massive amounts of money involved in these investments, then those kind of differences in percentages are very, very significant. In addition to those direct investments, British capitalists also have huge international investments in the form of loans and portfolio investments, so investments spread between many different companies. And the reason that capitalists get such high rates of return in Africa and Asia is that wages are lower on average, much lower. There tend to be less controls on health and safety and less environmental protections. And these conditions for profit, which are based on conditions for super exploitation, are enforced often by the governments of those countries, often in alliance with the imperialists who helped keep them in power and doing quite nicely out of the arrangement for themselves. Britain is highly dependent on the import of goods, with a net deficit of nearly £124 billion in 2014. And this is financed to a great extent through the export of services, with a net surplus of 89 billion in the same year. Nearly a third of those service exports are accounted for by financial services. And again, this is far higher proportion than any of the other, certainly any of the other G7 group of wealthy capitalist countries. Financial and insurance services employed more than 1 million people in Britain, and account for nearly 7% of GDP. And again, this is out of proportion for other big capitalist countries. And it's important to remember that financial services do not produce anything. So all this money involved in the financial sector is not producing any wealth itself. It's simply a means of redistributing wealth that's been produced elsewhere in the global economy, and sucking it into the hands of British finance capitalists. Then we have debt adding to this imperialist plunder. Between 1997 and 2016, this is on the next slide, just gone. So between 1997 and 2016, the total international debt for low and middle income countries grew by 251%, even though they repaid far more than that total debt over the same period. Most of these debts and the interest that's paid on them goes to imperialist countries. We are often told that the wealthy countries are helping the poorer countries. And the discussion is often about whether Britain is doing enough to help poorer countries. But in reality, it is the oppressed countries that subsidize the wealthy imperialist countries, with staggering amounts of wealth being transferred every year. There was a organization that calculated all the kind of different forms of transfers going in different directions. So taking into account aid that's paid to poorer countries, money that's taken out in debt repayments, all the different kind of flows. And they calculated that on balance, between 1980 and 2016, so over a period of 36 years, 12 trillion pounds was extracted from countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and taken to the so-called developed countries, or to use a more accurate term, I would say the imperialist countries. That is 12 trillion pounds that was produced in the poorest countries of the world and stolen just over that recent period. So that is why these countries are so poor. Today, an estimated net £40 billion is being extracted from Africa every year. And British companies play a leading role within that. If you look just at the kind of mining and kind of mineral resource sector, there are 100 companies listed on the British Stock Exchange that own an area of African land that is several times the size of Britain itself. And they're using that ownership to extract massive amounts of mineral wealth every year. And these figures, all those statistics I've given, actually significantly underestimate the full extent of the plunder that's going on because of the way that statistics are calculated. Together, this represents imperialist super exploitation, a parasitic relationship between Britain and oppressed countries. And without this, British capitalism could simply not survive. Racism makes this systematic plunder and impoverishment of large parts of humanity seem normal, acceptable, natural, right? To the extent that people accept kind of, racist depictions of Africa and Asia and Latin America, then it just seems natural that some countries are just simply poor, or you have arguments that these countries' poverty is because of their laziness or their corrupt leaders. And where imperialist countries intervene materially, either directly or through proxies, in order to defend those imperialist interests, they often justify this with stories about ethnic tensions or tribal conflicts, brutal dictators, or local power struggles that all play to racist ideas. And the circulation of these racist ideas encourage us all to just accept those explanations for imperialist interventions unquestioningly. So this undermines opposition, it isolates resistance, and enables the ruling class to maintain a pretense of liberalism, human rights, and democracy, which they then use again to justify further interventions in pursuit of their imperialist interests. Immigration controls help to enforce those conditions of super exploitation in oppressed countries by limiting the options for people to escape and to restrict the rights of those who do migrate to make it easier for capitalists to exploit them here in Britain. That is also getting worse, with surveillance and repression on the grounds of immigration status having been introduced into many aspects of our lives in recent years. So from employment to housing, to healthcare, to education, to getting a driving license or having a bank account, people operating in all those fields are being co-opted by law to act as additional border guards. And this process was started under a Labour government, and it's been further extended under the Tories and the Liberal Democrats. The current government have even found time during this pandemic to make progress in Parliament with a new immigration bill that increases repression even further and widens the net to also snatch some European migrants, particularly poorer migrants from Eastern Europe. Only the wealthiest are exempt from these immigration controls. Although, of course, if you are part of a racialized minority, you are also subject to constant suspicion, whatever your citizenship, sometimes up to and including the denial of basic rights and deportation, even if you're a British citizen, as we have seen in recent years with the disenfranchisement of members of the Windrush generation. Even people who were born in Britain, but who are associated with an oppressed country because of their skin color, their religion, or their culture, are subjected to racism, even at the same time as they are being told to sign up to British nationalism and to side with the British ruling class against new migrants, in exchange for promises of a little more acceptance. The ruling classes have seen what happens when oppressed sections of the working class in Britain make common cause with struggles in other countries. From the non-stop picket of the South African embassy against apartheid in the 1980s, to solidarity with the Irish liberation struggle, to movements in solidarity with Palestine, to the Black Lives Matter protests today. The ruling classes rightly fear this because such international alliances threaten their whole system of exploitation that relies on divide and rule. To try and contain this threat, they wield the carrot and the stick, buying off whatever leaders they can with community relations jobs and a bit of funding, while trying to isolate and criminalize anyone who will not be pacified. So capitalism and its apologists need racism. Whatever nice face they put on it, however many times Citigroup, Netflix, or Boris Johnson might say the words Black Lives Matter, they're never going to let racism go because it sustains their privileges. And the police? Their first job is to defend the right of capitalists to go on accumulating, no matter the cost for the working class. Given how much capitalism depends on racism, it should come as no surprise then that the British police is a fundamentally racist institution, because it reflects the racist order that it is protecting. Their job is to police the working class, to contain our anger at the exploitation we face. And the poorest, most exploited sections of the working class are disproportionately Black. The police's job is to protect the property of the ruling class, who are overwhelmingly white, and to an extent, to a very significant extent, are still based on the profits made through slavery. And their job is to ensure the smooth running of a system that is built on the robbery, exploitation, and murder of Black and brown people around the world. You cannot remove racism from such an institution with any amount of reforms or training programs. And this has been shown, the persistence of racism in the police, in a string of inspections, reports, inquiries, and in people's daily experience. The police are divided internally, so they have different faces they can show depending on the needs of a particular situation, with some sections focusing on community relations and the negotiation of social order, while other sections are normally held in reserve, but are brought in to restore order with brute force when necessary. And when that more open violence has been considered necessary, then the community relations again kicks in to try and pacify people. And the police do not and cannot do this alone. They rely on false friends of the working class, such as those who call protests but then try to silence the people's anger. The capitalist media will willingly lie in order to isolate those taking independent action against racism. Just look at the Nottingham Post reporting of the march last Sunday. An incredible and inspiring event that involved more than 1,000 people of the 4,000 who rallied on the forest, but which the Nottingham Post described as a small minority causing chaos. This has a long history, again, as part of strategies the British state has developed, initially as part of their colonial policy and then imported back to mainland Britain, to contain Black and anti-racist resistance. Following Britain's urban uprisings in the early 1980s, in which working class Black young people played a leading role, the state cultivated the appearance of making concessions by setting up public bodies for monitoring and action on racist harassment, and drawing in a section of Black leaders into relatively well-paid race relations and community posts. A small Black middle class was allowed to develop to encourage individual aspiration among Black young people as a way to undermine struggles for collective liberation. Alongside these carrots, the stick was deployed in targeted interventions backed by the media to link race to crime, and by doing so to criminalize whole communities that have been seen as the basis of resistance. All of this explains why Britain and the United States are still so deeply racist, despite centuries of struggle and reforms, because whatever else has changed over that period, the imperialist foundation has been left intact. This means that in order to defeat racism, we need to abolish imperialism, and replace Britain's parasitic relationship to countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America with relationships based on solidarity and respect. That will require handing back control over those countries' resources, an end to all forms of self-interested meddling, and reparations for centuries of plunder and exploitation. None of that is possible under capitalism, and the capitalists will never willingly go along with it. So we have to take the power out of their hands. The only way to do that is by building a mass revolutionary movement that can stop pleading for concessions and take over the running of this country to make the changes that we need. The power of the people is very clear on the streets of the United States right now, and we are starting to see it being built right here in Britain. We need to use that power to fight for a society built on solidarity, cooperation, and equality, with resources democratically controlled by the whole people, and use it in a rational way to meet people's needs and enable the full development of every individual. That is what we call socialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much then, Lee and Tom. So to those who are still on the stream, listening on Facebook or YouTube, we're going to close the streaming down now so that we can move to having a discussion. So please feel free, if you are watching the stream, to come on over to the Zoom meeting and participate. And of course, if you aren't able to do that, please don't forget to get a copy of our newspaper, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, which link can be posted. We'll post a link shortly into the comments over there. So Matt, if you could tell me when we've stopped streaming.